Thanks, Neil. When I suggested to give this talk, I didn't know how difficult it's going to be for me to describe my own personal efforts to implement mesoscale modeling operationally in Israel. It's very, very personal, and I first thought I'm going to describe it, how I have initialized the mesoscale modeling in Israel, and I was embarrassed with this title. And I thought, when I looked more carefully, I thought that it's really, I had some share in it, but there are many giants that I were standing on the, using or was learning from them. And I want to start, since we have here many young forecasters, and I don't consider myself anymore as a young forecaster, particularly in the last 5 years when the Air Force decided that's enough. Enough is enough. 30 years I volunteered, and I want to say something to the young forecasters. It's very difficult, I'm talking with the young forecaster, it's very difficult to imagine a period in which mesoscale modeling does not exist in the operational sense. It's very difficult to imagine such a thing. In fact, I'm quite sure that what I am going to say will sound very strange to the young forecasters here. But still, it was my dream. Mesoscale operational modeling was a dream. And I felt that the history put me in a place where my background, and I'm going to show you my background, put me in this location. It's here. I finished my master's before the army, and then I thought that I'm going to serve in electro-optics. But the army decided, no, you are going to be a forecaster. And I was against. And still, I became a forecaster in 1972. And I was released from the army on the 7th of November, 1977. And I came to the Hebrew University in 1977, right the next day I was there. I came to Yehuda Neumann. Professor Yehuda Neumann was the head of the Department of Meteorology at the Hebrew University. And I talked with him already before about running mesoscale model. He was doing a lot of work in this direction, in the research direction. But my thinking was about operation. I just was released from the army, 5 years doing forecasts, and I realized this is going to be a tremendous tool. So I started learning in 1977 and doing my PhD, and then when I finished, I moved to do my postdoc at the United States. And then I came back to be at the Department of Geophysics and Planetary Sciences. What I wish to talk about is some special points in these efforts to bring the mesoscale modeling to Israel. So it's not going to be very scientific, it's going to be more historical, and then I will give Uri Stein the place to explain how he, in fact, implemented during his PhD studies with me. So the motivation came from Yehuda Neumann. He was running the mesoscale modeling, I think one of the few in the world, starting in the early 70s, and doing it with Yitzhak Marer, who is not here, I think. He was designing models. At that time, running a mesoscale model means you design and you build your own model, which, as Tom explained before, it does not anymore exist, because now you take off the shelf the Wolf model and you run it. Now, when I designed my own model, we had two main models that were already existing. One was the main paper by Antes and Warner, 1978, in Monthly Weather Review. I used it to study and to learn how to build a mesoscale model. And the other was the Colorado State mesoscale model, which later developed as the RAMS model. And I simply have chosen some of the schemes to take from the RAMS, the earlier RAMS, there was no RAMS, and some of the schemes from Tom Warner's paper. I will show you in a moment which I chose from each model. And then I will show few points in the history, a letter that I wrote from the United States to the head of the Air Force Service, that we have to go to modeling, to mesoscale modeling. And another letter that I wrote, it's not here, to Yosef Lapid, that was at that time on the weather broadcasting. And I will also show his response. He later became the deputy to the prime minister. And when it became operational with Uri Stein, that started his PhD in 1986. Now, later, it became operational also in the Israel Met Service with Simon Krichak. And I got also some interesting point from Hanus Savuyervi, who is a professor at Helsinki, that I will show you using my model built 30 years ago. They are still using it, and he published this month a paper in Telos. And also in the Olympics, I will show something. They won the Olympics, and they wrote to me that it's thanks to my model from the PhD. Now, the model, my own mesoscale model, I described how I designed the model. It appears in the list that Pilke's book on mesoscale meteorological modeling writes. I'm lucky to have Alpert with an A at the beginning, so it is the first in the list of 23 mesoscale models that exist in 1984. He did a thorough review, Pilke, and both models, also yours and others, are there. This is, he called it the Alpert-Neumann mesometeorological model, and it was two-dimensional when I ran my PhD model, and it has some interesting features. Some that I take from the RAMS, for example, the cubic spline interpolation for the advection. I decided this is doing a better job than the advection scheme you have used. But for the diffusion, I preferred yours. So it is a combination of different numerical schemes that today there's no opportunity for any student to start such a mission. It was used, the first phenomena that I studied was the sea breeze in Lake Kinneret, Sea of Galilee. And this was the work, the main phenomena I studied in my PhD. Later, I used the same model for Lake Michigan, and this appeared in 1983. Now, an interesting letter to Yosef Lapid, who was the director of the Broadcasting Authority, I wrote in the 1st of December 1981. I didn't translate it, but I'm telling him here that we have to improve the presentation of weather forecasts in Israel. I was invited by some of you may know Frank Field to the NBC. He put me into his preparation. He's the Danny Rupp of that time in New York. Danny Rupp is going to be here, I hope, later. And I got the answer from Yossi Lapid, as you can see here, that in Israel it's not so interesting to see the weather maps. I'm translating because it's not interesting. It's interesting in United States, in Europe, but not in Israel. Perhaps when we will move to color TV, in Israel we will start showing these synoptic maps. This was the response by Yosef Lapid. Now, another interesting letter that I wrote trying to implement mesoscale modeling in Israel was to Carl Pick, who was then the head of research in the Israel Air Force. This is the 2nd of December, 1982. I also sent it from the United States. We have to run a mesoscale model in the Air Force. And here I got some more favorable response from Richard, who was then the head of the Air Force, and actually said, yes, we should do it, and this is how it started. Now, I want to show also some more interesting, that I mentioned before, what happened with my model 30 years ago. When Uri Stein came to me to do his PhD, he will show in a moment what he did and implement the mesoscale modeling, the MM4, for operational runs in Israel. When he came to me, he asked, what model should I use? And I had a big temptation telling him, you should use my model. But I told him, you know what? Do a search of the market. What kind of models exist? And he came with me. We talked about 5 models from Drexel University, your model, MM4, and the earlier Rams model. And then Uri came to me back, and you don't know how difficult it was for me, your decision, to run with the MM4 model. It was difficult for me, because I wanted very much that you will take my own model. 2 other groups continue till today running my own model. One is the University of Helsinki, Professor Hanus Savijärvi, who served in the last 10 years or so as the head of the department in the University of Helsinki, is still running it, and he published this month a paper in TELUS using the model. Not only that, he told me, you presented some Olympics result. He told me in the email, Finland won an Olympic medal because of the good forecast of the winds in the China Olympics by your model. So it's not being run in Israel, it's being run in Finland today, 2010, and published papers, and it's being run in Louvain-la-Neuve. It was developed to full 3D model with cloudiness and so on. So this is how I feel about mesoscale modeling. And perhaps one more point I would mention, because Lou Cellini is here. I want to say something about something that I learned in NASA Goddard when visiting Lou Cellini in my sabbatical in 1986. I remember a big debate that was going on in the United States about the President's Day snowstorm. And Lou appeared in many conferences I was attending at least 3 or 4 places, but there was a big debate saying that what are the source for this big snowstorm? And you always talked about upper level jet stream forcing and not from the surface. And others were publishing about the surface. I even showed you a paper that I wrote with Baruch Ziv in his master's on the Sharaf cyclone. And I was writing it in NASA. And I was talking about the forcing from the surface. The gradient in spring, between the Mediterranean Sea, the very strong gradient between the Mediterranean Sea and the North African continent, which is the reason in the spring it is maximized. And Baruch Ziv did an excellent job to show with a simple baroclinic model that the peak of baroclinicity is going to be in April. I showed it to you, and you say, no, I don't believe it's surface forcing. It is important, but there must be something upper forcing from a trough or from a jet stream. And then I contacted the ECMWF to get the first cross-section. Somebody mentioned to get a cross-section from ECMWF, a vertical cross-section, was a huge task in 1986. I had to have a friend there, Jill Someria, who was top there, up, to get for me this cross-section and put it into the paper. And then I came to Louis Cellini and showed him this cross-section. I told you, because we saw this divergence aloft, which has to come along with the convergence. But still, it remains the chicken and the egg. So it's very interesting, but both, it was there, the forcing up, and I had to include it in the revision of the paper, which appeared in JGR in 1989. Now, but what I learned a lot from Cellini is the synergy between the upper level forcing and the surface forcing. You need it. Sometimes some researchers focus on what happens at the surface, others focus on what happens up there. And very often it is a synergy. And this is how we came with the factor separation method, which helps separating the synergy, which is during Uri Stein study. And I included in the book, which is going to appear, this is the book which is going to appear in January, Factor Separation in the Atmosphere Application Future Prospects, in Cambridge University Press. And I included the quotation from Synergy. But it was very difficult to find early 80s quotations about Synergy. I found only another paper which appears in these dots here. Now about Warner's input, and with that I leave you the place. Tom Warner told me that he was the reviewer of our first paper on the factor separation. He exposed himself, I think. And this paper in JAZ was really the basis for the development of the book, and which is now being used, the method is being used in many places for different applications. This is the book. And the last thing I wish I mentioned already, yes, we had operational MM5 in Tel Aviv University for the last 10 years. Unfortunately, last summer, we had a problem with the machine, and we stopped, but we are going to start with the Wolf. And the 10 years, jointly with the Air Force, we studied a lot about the MM5, but I'm not going to show anything. I'm going to stop here and allow Uri Stein.